We'll make notes of
Coming,
what
everyone.
should I say on something
I'm
from the
Joanna Chataway, and I'm head of the department of the Science, Technology, Engineering and Public Policy department in the engineering faculty here at UCL. We are absolutely delighted to be able to welcome Roger Pielke tonight to give his inaugural lecture as an honorary professor at STEaPP. Of course, Roger's based at the University of Colorado in Boulder. Most of his time is spent there. But we hope, now he's an honorary at STEaPP, that he'll be a regular visitor. Roger probably needs no introduction to the people in this room, but just to say that he has, of course, worked across a number of areas, including climate science. We had a wonderful seminar, a research seminar at lunch today on Roger's work on gender issues in sport, which was absolutely fascinating and actually very moving. But for many of us, what Roger is best known for is that book, The Honest Broker, which is for many a foundational text underpinning all sorts of intellectually stimulating and actually very practical messages about how to structure research and evidence and advice in policy making. And I think for me it's been such an important book. It's not only intellectually important, but also been a very practical sort of guide for me. So thank you for that. And I'm sure I speak on behalf of many others who want to thank you for that. The Honest Broker was published in 2007, I think. Yeah. So, and I don't think it's a secret that you're working on a sequel. And tonight's lecture, which is entitled Institutions of Appropriate Expertise, might give us an insight into what you're thinking in terms of the sequel. So very much looking forward to it. Before I hand over to Roger, I'll just explain how the session will work tonight. So Roger's going to speak for about 25 minutes. Then we'll have the panel come up to the stage, and I'll ask panel members a number of questions and get their thoughts on Roger's talk, and then we'll open it up for Q&A and come back to all of you. I will introduce panel members as we come to them after Roger's statement. So Roger, over to you.
All right, thanks, Joe. That was such a gracious introduction. There's nowhere for the talk to go but down from there. And thanks to Arthur and Chris for the invitation, the opportunity to be here. It's fantastic. I will say, so my visit this week is going to be remembered by me, I guarantee, forever, because on Monday I had a chance to meet with my editor at Cambridge University Press, Chris Harrison, who informed me. We sat down and he said, Roger, I'm going to let you know, next summer I turn 65, and I'm not going to be in this job very long. He said, so if you're ever going to do your sequel to The Honest Broker, you better get it done soon. And so I told him I'm going to deliver it next year, stop dithering, and so the sequel to The Honest Broker is coming. And tonight I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the ideas that are at the core of that book. This is Boulder, and my family's here that get to see my talk. That's where we're from, but I've been in Oslo, which has been fantastic this past fall. All right, so here's what I'm going to do. I see my job tonight as providing some provocations, some stimulation for the panel discussion, which I'm looking forward to. So I'm going to introduce a vocabulary and a framework. I'm going to draw on some of the work of Steve Rayner, the late Steve Rayner from Oxford, who's a good friend and mentor. I'll suggest some precedents for institutions of appropriate expertise. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the lessons from COVID-19. I've led a project for the last almost 3 years, as long as the pandemic, on science advice in the pandemic, based on about 20-country comparative study. And then I'll have some recommendations. All right, so Steve Rayner's framework that I am increasingly using and coming back to is focused on 3 concepts. Wicked problems, clumsy solutions, and uncomfortable knowledge. One thing to understand about this framework that Steve presented Wicked problems aren't problems, and clumsy solutions aren't solutions. A wicked problem is best thought of as a condition, a chronic condition that we find in society that simply can't be solved. So poverty, crime, climate change, issues that stick with us over time. We can do better or worse on these wicked problems, but they're going to be with us. And so the key is knowing what does it mean to do better, and how do we do better. Clumsy solutions. I've been teaching during the pandemic, so I can. That's not a wicked problem. Clumsy solutions are solutions that are perhaps unsatisfactory because people come to agree on action for a lot of different reasons. Walter Lippmann, the American political commentator, once said, and I think it's important to understand this, that politics is not about getting people to think alike, it's about getting people who think differently to act alike. Clumsy solutions occur when people decide on a shared course of action for very different reasons. That's why they're clumsy. People don't agree on the nature of problems, if there is a problem, but it turns out, and thank goodness it does turn out this way, in politics we can agree to act together, and we don't know how we'll have to think the same. Steve presented uncomfortable knowledge as a bridge between these concepts, between wicked problems and clumsy solutions. Knowledge is uncomfortable when it challenges institutions. Institutions get very comfortable. They like doing what they're doing. There's a reason for that. And then when their status quo is challenged, that becomes uncomfortable. And so I'm going to talk about disruptive knowledge tonight. All right, so what is an institution? I like this definition. It's from a philosopher, political scientist in the US from a long time ago. But the basic idea is that an institution is a pattern of culture traits. Institutions reflect cultural assumptions, norms, behaviors. This is a picture of the doorway to our flat in Oslo. And I show it to you. It certainly means nothing. It is indicative of a structure. And a lot of times I've come to think that in science advice, when we talk about connecting science and policy, we're really good at building structures, but we're not so good at building institutions. What's a door to an institution look like? Looks like this. So when I show you this, for my American family, this is number 10, this is Downing Street. In the British context, this evokes feelings, particularly in the last month, but understanding of an institution that is much deeper than just a doorway, some windows. And the difference between a structure on the left and an institution is really important for thinking through how we implement science advice in institutions. And it's a question I'm not going to fully answer tonight, but it's one maybe we can discuss, is how do we turn science advice into a strong institution instead of just a structure? All right, so Dan Sarowitz and Steve Renner. Dan published this paper after Steve's death. The site is there, it's really a great paper. Appropriate expertise emerges from institutions that ground their legitimacy not on claims of expert privilege and the authority of an undifferentiated science, but on institutional arrangements for managing the competing values, beliefs, worldviews, and facts arrayed around such incredibly complex problems as climate change or toxic chemical regulation or nuclear waste storage. So institutions put together, of course, facts, but also values, beliefs, worldviews, and all of the elements that make up a political culture. And so what I want to take on tonight in my brief remarks is to talk about, well, what might an institution of appropriate expertise look like when we say, all right, I want to take expertise and connect it with policy in the context of politics. So where do we find these institutions? And let me say at the outset, my experience and my understanding working at this messy interface of science and politics is that in general we do really good connecting science and politics. It's a little bit, the analogy I keep coming back to is that policy scholars, particularly ones who focus on wicked problems and clumsy solutions, a little bit like doctors who focus on people with bad diseases. There's a lot of healthy people out there. We probably should be studying healthy people, but bad diseases are really important. And so you might get the idea from people like me who spend their time in highly politicized, contentious debate that, boy, science and policy must be a mess. The reality is we do pretty well in most contexts. There are these strange situations like COVID or climate change that are persistent, chronic issues that require some deep thinking. But here's a few examples. This isn't a comprehensive list of areas where I think in general we do pretty well. So take agriculture. It wasn't so long ago, my parents' generation, 1950s, 1960s, there was expectation that there was going to be massive global famine. We weren't going to be able to feed everyone. Someone just sent me a book by Isaac Asimov, who when I was growing up was one of my favorite science fiction writers, who talked about a dystopian world future with a population of 8 billion people. Can you believe it? There's an idea that there's no way we could feed the planet. And agricultural productivity has and is expected to keep pace with population growth. And the problems associated with agriculture are not creating enough food for people, but its distribution, equity, and the environmental impacts. Health. The world has seen overall a doubling in life expectancy over the last century. It's not equally distributed around the world, a lot of inequities, but if you think to 100 years from now, there wasn't vaccinations, there wasn't things like penicillin, all of the modern technologies we have for medical care and public health simply weren't present. Again, we've made a lot of progress there. National defense, one of the places where expertise is, I think, most effectively wielded and marshaled. Whatever you think about the defense establishment, they do a really good job, mainly, I think, because people's lives are at stake today and tomorrow when they make decisions. Diplomacy, I mentioned that earlier, but diplomacy is an area where we have established a body of experts who make diplomacy happen. Diplomacy isn't a magical thing that you put some prime ministers and presidents in a room and they come up with agreements. No, there's people who go to diplomacy school and they get degrees in diplomacy and they work behind the scenes in departments of state and so on around the world. Economics is what I'm going to talk about in my example, and I've been using this as an example of a well-developed set of institutions that connect expertise with policy. And the first response I get from people usually is, economics, really? That's the one you're going to pick? Didn't we have a financial crisis not so long ago, and how good are economic forecasts? But I think that's precisely the point, is that if you look at governments around the world, every government has a vast array of entities whose job it is to collect data on the basic functioning of the economy, to share that data with policymakers, embargo it so it doesn't affect markets and so on. I would say that economics is probably the most well-developed area where expertise is connected to policymaking, partly because our economies, our societies, our governments are organized around economic principles. So of course economics is important. If you ask an economist at a central bank for their long-term forecasts, they're not going to say, well, let me tell you about 2100 or 2050 or 2030. They'll tell you about 4 years from now. Maybe 6 years from now if you're lucky. But an understanding of the basic limitations of economics, I think, is one of the strengths, actually, of that discipline in connecting to policy. So I'll just talk a little bit about economics. So here's Queen Elizabeth. 2008, she went to LSE to be briefed on the emerging financial crisis at the time. And she was told that this is a massive problem that involved collateralized debt obligations, global real estate market, things gone bad. And she asked a fairly obvious question. If these things were so large, how come everyone missed them? And so the British Academy said, okay, we have our charge. We're going to answer that question. So they put together a committee and reported back the next year, which I found really interesting. So here's what they said, and I just want to point out the end of the sentence. So given the forecasting failure, the inability to anticipate the global financial crisis, these British institutions put together an effort to understand why. They said, well, we might develop a new shared horizon scanning capability so that you never need to ask your question again. We'll never not see a looming catastrophe. All right, well, we've all lived through and are still living through a pandemic. We've seen other financial and economic crises, Brexit in the UK. And this is an example of what another Steve Rayner term is called the social construction of ignorance. Right? That sometimes institutions blind us to reality. Of course, we're not going to be able to anticipate all future economic crises. So Jacqueline Best is a scholar in Toronto who's published a number of, and I've never met her, I'd love to have a chance to meet her and talk to her, fascinating papers on expertise in central banking. And one of the questions she asks is, what do institutions do when faced with their own ignorance? And she builds on some of Rayner's work, and she comes up with three replies to this question. One is fudging. So the presentation of evidence to conceal institutional ignorance. We might say that the presentation to the Queen by the Royal Academy was a bit of fudging. Yeah, we missed that big crisis, but don't worry, we got it. Next one, no problem. Denial. The failure to acknowledge that ignorance even exists in the first place. Yeah, we just got to tune a few of our parameters, no problem. We'll just fix our models. And then the one category which I think is really important to understand, puzzling is what she called it. Genuinely reflexive and responsive kind of economic policy making which uses such moments of confusion as a spur to recognize the limits of existing expertise and rethink key assumptions. Best argues that central banks, when they are at their best, actually do this sort of puzzling. And then we see this in economics more than in other areas. And I think my experience at this science policy interface is that puzzling in most cases is extremely rare. Social construction of ignorance and pretending like, yeah, we'll know everything. If we just get some more research dollars, give us some more time, we'll have a better model. Puzzling is really important for institutional success. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Best's work. Here's a number of central banks. We talk about what she has found in her exploration of how central banks manage this boundary between expertise, which is what we experts think we have, and ignorance, which is what we have more of than our expertise. All right, so Best concludes, central banks' authority is linked to their expertise. The knowledge that is often most uncomfortable for them is the fact of their own ignorance in the face of an uncertain economy. This is a cartoon. I show this at the first day one of my graduate seminar on science and technology policy. It appeared in the New Yorker. It appeared in the weeks after Donald Trump was elected. There's a guy on an airplane standing up. These smug pilots have lost touch with regular passengers like us. Who thinks I should fly the plane? And of course, it's funny, because we're not going to vote for Jim to fly the plane. It's not a democracy. Right? The pilot is an expert. But who decides where the plane goes? You do when you buy your ticket. So decision making is really complicated because we have to balance out the needs of democracy, which means that everybody gets to vote, anyone can be elected, but at the same time, if we want to make aircraft carriers and nuclear power plants and energy policy and dealing with climate change, if we want to make all that work, we need experts. So how to balance out in our expert institutions the fact that, yeah, I'm an expert, I know a lot, and at the same time, yeah, I'm an expert, I'm ignorant of more than I know, is a really difficult challenge. And perhaps it's an asset for economists. Because when economists say, yeah, we're ignorant about the long-term economic future, most of us go, yeah, I get that, okay. But you're still the central bank and you still determine interest rates. So how we build in that balance between the legitimacy conferred by expertise, but the reality of the limitations of that expertise is something that I think that we need to discuss and talk about more when it comes to expert institutions. Uncomfortable knowledge. So Best says, what I discovered in my research was not simply evidence of uncertainty, error, the gap between theory and practice and pragmatic policy, or even lying. What I found instead were clear moments in which policymakers both recognized their ignorance, the fact that there were things they simply did not know, and developed a range of strategies for dealing with it. And one of the key elements here in what she found, is that if we're uncertain, or even worse, if we're ignorant of the future, that is not an obstacle to effective decision-making. Decision-making under uncertainty, most of us have heard of, but decision-making under ignorance is something that we can excel at also. If you asked medical doctors in the 1920s, how are we going to double the human lifespan by 2022? The answer would be, we don't know. But we know enough to get started moving in that direction. If you ask someone, well, how are we going to decarbonize the global economy by 2050 or 2060 or 2070? The only honest answer right now, we don't know. But we know enough to get started. And so dealing with ignorance is important. This is a cartoon. I like this one because it's kind of, it shows this deficit model of science that is so common that we experts, our job is to uncover the truth, and that you can't read that, but it says federal government, and politicians are trying to obscure the truth. It's a cartoon, it's funny, but it's not real. I mean, that's not how things actually work in practice. All right, practical ignorance, which involves mobilizing ignorance in ways that can be quite useful. For example, allowing policymakers to discount uncomfortable evidence, or avoid responsibility for failure, or reflect more critically on how to develop policy in the absence of complete knowledge. Accepting both expertise and ignorance requires leadership. If you want to have a sense of what uncomfortable knowledge feels like, I'm going to give you 2 examples. This is a book by Matt Ridley and Alina Chan on the origins of COVID. COVID apparently could have come from a research-related incident, or it could have come from a wet market in Wuhan. As an outside observer, I'm convinced that we're ignorant of the right answer. But institutions find this question deeply uncomfortable. In fact, so uncomfortable that the world scientific community has not been able to organize itself and have a systematic exploration of the question of origin. Deeply uncomfortable. All right, so if that one doesn't make you uncomfortable, here's another one. The 1.5 degree temperature target has long been recognized by modelers and scientists as it's not going to happen. And it started to be recognized as The Economist from just last week. Institutions get very nervous and uncomfortable when you say, all right, we're going to have to rethink climate targets. Climate change is real, it's important, but if 1.5 degrees is off the table, which has been so comfortable, right? It's like a nice sweater, it's warm, we've had it for a long time. What do we do next? Uncomfortable knowledge means that there are leaders in science and politics who are willing to take on questions that may be challenging to the institutions we've developed. All right, so for the last couple minutes of my part of the presentation, I'm going to talk about this project I've led called STEaPP, Evaluation of Science Advice in a Pandemic Emergency. You'll see we have Chile on there. I don't have the report yet, so I can't talk about Chile. This is a project that was funded by the U.S. National Science Foundation, and it's one of those things, a rapid project, that's the acronym, and they give you a little bit of money real fast. And then I've asked basically what I call a coalition of the willing. We have 20 cases, and about 12 have reported. There's a number of papers, if you're interested, that are out there. I'm just going to talk about some of the top-line findings from this project. So the first one, you may not be surprised by this, but with only a few exceptions, national and international science advisory mechanisms were unprepared for a pandemic. It shouldn't have been a surprise. We were ignorant as to when the pandemic would hit, but there was no uncertainty that the world was going to face it. And we're right there again now. We're going to face another pandemic. It might be tomorrow. It might be another 100 years. But we're going to face it. We were not prepared. We should have been prepared. Science advisory mechanisms lack clarity on their purpose and roles in providing expert advice to policymakers. Are science advisory bodies, are they there to answer questions? How many COVID cases do we have? How many people are vaccinated? What are the economic consequences of a 3-week shutdown? There are questions that policymakers might have that scientists could answer. Alternatively, do we expect science advisory mechanisms to offer policy options? All right, so what are our choices that fall in between complete lockdown and let her rip? What's in the middle? One of the findings, finding 3, the integration of knowledge necessary to provide effective guidance on policy alternatives, was rarely done by expert advisors. One of the key findings that we found worldwide, certainly the case here in the UK, that the big cleavage in society in the pandemic was between public health outcomes and economic outcomes. If you work in a restaurant and you need to go in and work in order to make money, a shutdown is really bad for you. If you're scheduled to have surgery for cancer and that gets shut down because of the pandemic, other sorts of mortality might increase. There was a need to integrate public health outcomes and economic outcomes across society. And the SAGE group in the UK at the very beginning said, well, economics is not in our purview. We have a treasury to do that. And it turns out that was just handed off to policymakers. People say, well, you know what, we elect people to integrate knowledge and make hard decisions. Well, guess what? Integrating economics and public health in a global pandemic is not something anyone has been trained to do. This is why we need experts to put these things together. I have not seen, in our case studies at least, any example of a country that did a good job of integrating economics and public health in the form of policy options. Finding 4, this is a big one. We've come to call groups of scientists and experts who self-organize outside of government to either challenge official science advisory bodies or to challenge the government itself, shadow science advisory mechanisms. The idea of a shadow advisory body, again, that's borrowing from the British shadow government idea, the idea of a loyal opposition. So this idea starts with goodwill. The idea that, okay, you're an expert, you're self-organizing, you want to make things better. Now, that's not always the case. What we've seen is that around the world, a lot of these shadow science advisory methods have sprung up, and they're not new. You know, if you go to my blog, I give shadow science advice, 3 times a week. And that's what we do as experts. But I think you could say during the pandemic, it reached a level where it actually became confusing. In the UK, you had the SAGE on the one hand, and on the other hand, you had the independent SAGE. I mean, what would you want, the SAGE or the one that's independent? There's examples of members of parliament and members of the public deeply confused about, and I think it was somewhat cynical to appropriate the name, even though the independent SAGE did probably lead to some greater transparency of the official SAGE. In the United States, a shadow science advisor appeared on Donald Trump's favorite TV station, Fox News, and he turned that into a position leading the entire pandemic response for the U.S. government. Remarkable. Sweden had a deeply contested battle between its shadow science, the Science Forum, Swedish Science Forum, and the official. On the other hand, in the Philippines, our case study there found that a shadow science advisory body was actually useful filling in a gap that the government didn't fill. So shadow science advice can be helpful, and it can be deeply pathological. And the key is to know the difference. And what I suggest to experts is, if you don't know that difference, slow down before you announce your independent group and go public. And the emerging evaluations of pandemic response, there are some exceptions. I know there's an inquiry going on here in the UK and a few other places, but largely they've ignored mechanisms of expert advice. One of the great failings of the pandemic is in the United States. There is no high-level expert advisory body on the pandemic. Now, under Donald Trump, I say, all right, Donald Trump, there's a lot of things we can say about Donald Trump. He was advised by his political sycophants and his family and so on. When the Biden administration came in, I thought, okay, they're going to fix this oversight. They're going to create a high-level expert advisory body to provide guidance. No. The United States is one of the only countries in the world that does not have a high-level expert advisory body, which to me is just amazing. All right, this is near the end. 5 practical steps. So from our project, these are 5 things that I'm recommending, and it'll be more fleshed out in our final report. So the first thing, and these are recommendations to governments and experts. Establish what I'm calling science advisory sous-sherpas. So if you think about the G20 or efforts at diplomacy, you see the heads of state, they're sitting around their table. And then on the outside of the room, sitting in chairs, are people called the Sherpas. These are people who kind of make things happen. All right, the people who aren't in the room, who work all year round, those are the sous-sherpas. These are the people who make diplomacy happen. We need, in governments, it doesn't have to be a large number, but a body of career professionals who have expertise at the science and policy intersection. so they can work with experts and they can work with policymakers to make science advice happen. It's a little bit like if your science advice structure is like my front door in Norway, that's a problem. It needs to be, when I say science advice, it would be great if we had a culture where most people in this room would say, oh, I know what that means, I get it, I understand that. The same way I do number 10 or diplomacy. This is a boring, wonky one, but we need model terms of reference. A science advisor to a major government said, I felt like I was put in a room with other experts and the government expected magic would happen. That's not how it works. You just, I mean, if you've been in a faculty meeting, you know that you put a bunch of experts in a room, magic doesn't often happen. Terms of reference refers to the expectations, the policies, procedures for how the expert body is going to operate, including what it's supposed to deliver on what timescale. It would be great, this is a fundable project for PhD students out there, to collect terms of reference for expert advisory bodies and find who does it best. And then let's put them in an archive, and so when someone says, oh, we're starting from scratch with an expert advisory body, what do the terms of reference look like? Again, boring, wonky, kind of nerdy policy stuff, but this is the nuts and bolts of how things get done. We need a formalized advisory committee empowerment. So again, another expert advisor, a chief scientific advisor actually said, you know, the way we put together experts, young people won't know what this means, but I looked at my Rolodex, and I called up people who I knew. And I said, well, you have relevant expertise, can you serve on this committee? Even in big countries like the United States, we should be able to have a catalog of people with relevant expertise. Oh, an Icelandic volcano just went off. We need to put together a committee on air travel. Oh, good, because I have all those experts. We assembled them last year. Oh, we have a pandemic, but it's coronavirus, not influenza. No problem. We know who the relevant experts are. One thing we've learned is that expertise needs to be diverse, both disciplinarily, but also it has to be diverse in terms of the society that's supposed to be informing them. If it's just a bunch of, you know, sorry, middle-aged white guys, it's not going to be perceived as legitimate. Or if they're perceived as being on one side of the political spectrum. So we've got to give more thought to how we put together panels. We have to train experts on media relations. I had, again, other experts said, you know, I came out of the committee, and which was great, we had our discussions and so on, and I had a microphone in my face. And I didn't know what to do. Am I supposed to defend the same position I had around the table? Well, here's why my study's the best, and that committee doesn't know what they're talking about. Am I supposed to support the government's policy? Am I supposed to criticize it? Am I supposed to say no comment? We need to do better by our experts so that when things become political, they understand. Now, if you compare military intelligence, people who participate in advising the government on military intelligence have no problem in their media relations. You don't often see someone say, yeah, I was down at MI5 and I said we should bomb this country and not that country, and they didn't listen to me. It doesn't work that way. They have a set of norms. They have a set of understanding. They have an institution. And then the last thing is we have to demand political leadership. And I've seen, particularly in the US context, when people say political leadership, sometimes they mean politicians should do what the experts want them to do. That's not what I mean. All I mean by that is politicians should respect the importance of expertise. They should respect that there is a interface between science and policy. In a democracy, decisions can be made for whatever reason by politicians. That's their job. And if experts would make it a different way, you know, tough for the experts. That's how democracies work. But we need to create a culture, again, it gets back to culture, where expertise is respected and advice is given doesn't mean it has to be taken. In many places we saw an utter disdain for expertise. And similarly, we saw a disdain for politics by experts. So we need political leadership inside and outside science. All right, that's it. I look forward to our panel discussion. Here's how you can find me, and I'm happy to hear from you. And thanks for listening. I look forward to discussing.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you, Roger. Can I invite our panelists up to the table? Good tight, isn't it? Oh, thank you. stimulating lecture, Roger. Thank you. I'm going to just throw a few questions at our panelists, and I'll introduce you all as we go along. So, the first question is to Sarah Chaytor. Got two Sarahs.
Oh, I really was hoping you weren't going to start with Roger's a hard act to follow.
Roger, it's a hard act to follow, but you're up to it, Sarah. I'm very, very confident. So Sarah is our Director of Policy and Strategy at UCL, Research Policy and Strategy at UCL, and Director of our UCL Public Policy body, which oversees so much of the work that goes on at UCL, that informs policy, that responds to policy, that's engaged with policy. So she's in a good position, I think, to think about this question. One of the things that comes through strongly from your talk, Roger, is where you leave us, that we need to think about stronger institutions at the science policy interface. At the same time, one of the things that we saw during COVID-19 was a huge increase in the number of academics, of researchers, of civil society actors who became engaged in policy. And so it seems to me there's a tension there between wanting to foster that informed and engaged participation with policy, and yet needing to kind of cohere and have some way of a pathway through the chaos. But what do you think, Sarah? What do we need stronger science institutions at that science policy interface?
This is a really interesting question. I'm going to start by saying something that is possibly a bit self-interested as somebody who works in a university, which is, I think, to some degree, universities are those institutions. They have a breadth of expertise. They have people who are both very committed and dedicated to learning and new knowledge and understanding the world. And they also, in general, have a very strong commitment to societal impact. So I actually think, in some ways, we have a good starting point because there is an entire network in every country of those sorts of institutions. So that's my first thought, but I acknowledge it sounds a little self-interested coming from somebody in a university. It makes me want to unpack a little bit what we mean by institutions and what we mean by stronger. And I think a lot of the reflections I have had were actually better expressed by Roger, so I'm not going to rehash it. But I think there is something really interesting about the blurring between what is a structure and what is an institution, and when does one become the other. And I was thinking a little bit about the role of SAGE, because the UK context is what I know the best. And in my mind, SAGE isn't really an institution, it's actually a sort of a pop-up structure that comes up in times of emergency. And I think one of the things we saw during the pandemic, which is sort of your point, Joe, I think, or part of your point, is that people suddenly thought there was this thing called SAGE and it should exist all the time and it should incorporate all knowledge about everything. And actually the existing structure of SAGE that we have just wasn't up to that. And actually it's not really its job. Its purpose is to come together to mobilise knowledge in response to very specific, I think, problems. And it makes me think as well, using your wonderful typology, you know, actually COVID is more of a condition than a problem. And SAGE exists really to address problems. It also made me think a little bit about the legitimacy, I suppose, that SAGE did or didn't have. And I think that links really closely to the public understanding, I suppose, the public understanding of the role, what it was there to do, but also the really horrible, I think, and very disingenuous idea that we were somehow going to follow the science. You know, when the science was emerging and there was no consensus and there wasn't established evidence and it was all about the best, you know, the best available knowledge on a given day or at a given hour. I think that idea that we were going to follow the science, that there was such a thing as the science, and that it would somehow tell us what to do was completely disingenuous and really damaging, actually, to the whole idea of institutions of appropriate expertise. The other thing I wanted to reflect on a little bit, I suppose, is where the policy demand comes from. And that's what I'd really also like, if I can, to press Roger on, because I think we saw a lot about the need to cohere, I suppose, expertise, the need to have a framework for bringing together different sorts of knowledge and different perspectives. And I really welcomed your point about diversity. I think that's utterly critical. But how do we actually cohere some of the demand? And again, SAGE is one mechanism for that. that, but if you think about science advice across the entirety of government and not just in the context of a pandemic, there is demand occurring in different government departments and at different levels of government. There are different capabilities and structures at those different levels of government in the UK. And there isn't actually a very easy way for any expert or indeed any institution like a university to understand where that demand is coming from and how best to respond. So actually it leads me to possibly a bit of a cop-out thought, which is maybe it's not only about the need for stronger institutions, but it's about thinking through what are the connections that bring those different institutions together. How can they be iterative? How can they be responsive? And how do we really make sure that those connections are meaningful, I suppose, and not just empty structures? So the question for me is maybe how do you institutionalise those connections? And then the one final thought that I just wanted to offer, which is a little bit facetious, but as you were talking about that entirely legitimate role of politicians as the decision makers, I wonder if actually there is a challenge back to them to be the honest brokers for policy decisions. So experts provide the different forms of expertise, but it's politicians that need to bring that together with all the other inputs into the policy process. And I think that's what we need. We need more honest broker politicians to do that for our citizens.
Fantastic, thank you, Sarah. And maybe some of you will pick up on some of those issues in questions. We'll certainly come back to Roger on that. I think it leads fairly nicely actually into the second question, which goes to Sarah Edwards, who's a Professor of Bioethics in our department in STEaPP. And it's really about this issue of if we're thinking about policy demand and where demand comes from, the relationship between policy advice, policy makers and politicians, it raises the question of kind of collective values that scientists have and the extent to which what should the dialogue be like between the scientists who may have one set of collective values and other stakeholders, including politicians and publics, which may have radically different values. What does that look like, and how did we? You were speaking about ambiguity actually before the talk, and I was thinking about that as Roger was kind of making reference to those issues in his talk.
Yes, well, yes, I thoroughly enjoyed your lecture. I learned a lot and wrote down quite a few notes, so I've got my own notes now, a little bit muddled. And I've got sort of more comments on perhaps certain aspects of what you've been covering, as well as this point about sort of collective values, if indeed we know what those are of experts, and how we define which groups of experts, what they're expert in exactly. I know you're talking very much about the institutions, but I'm more new to the idea of institutions working on lock or on maths. So, I mean, my experience or observations throughout the pandemic were seeing how a number of the usual suspects in science were offering advice and not necessarily including what I considered, I mean, rightly or wrongly, to be the full set of relevant skills and knowledge. I mean, I can list a whole load of examples. There wasn't enough in the UK SAGE or the WHO on deep mechanisms of action for different drugs, understanding of biology. There seemed to be a predetermined agreement that a big randomised controlled trial should be done, and we should get on with that, right from the get-go. Forget sort of small-scale, observations, and of course that led to sort of controversies about particular drugs that have been used in that trial. But I guess that's the closest example I can think of that would be a straightforward example of a collective value of an institution. And lot of us are in the process of, dissecting that, writing it up, and hoping to make visible our own sort of thoughts. But certainly there are other cases when we're talking about ignorance being managed, disguised. Again, you can think of numerous examples. The categories of fudging before you got to the marvellous puzzling, which I love. There was another example of deliberate reluctance to learn or gather evidence. And I think that was another real sort of gut-wrenching sort of observation on how the science advice or the policy demand lacked. The example in question actually ended up being supported, the line of inquiry, by UCL STEaPP. So this was very, very early on. A biologist colleague of mine, Joanna Chataway, she's a sort of a basic scientist. She likes her mechanisms, her molecules. She knows an awful lot about host range of bugs and the big picture. So lots of bugs. She doesn't sort of spend her entire life on just one bug, and most scientists do, just sort of go down on one track and miss that big picture. So she recognised immediately from how the virus was infecting through the ACE2 receptors and all the sciencey stuff that my limits rapidly become obvious. But she saw that SARS-CoV-2 was going to infect a lot of different species. She wrote that up. A couple of journals were interested, before it went to review, and then the comments came back. Well, there's no evidence, but strong theory, and then DEFRA, if I'm allowed to sort of go into just a few details. We talked about SAGE, so why not DEFRA? It seemed to be too complicated an issue, even to recognise the importance of gather data on. So the suggestion at the time, very early on, was small-scale surveillance of what were then thought to be the high-risk species, close contact with humans, maybe around a hospital where we knew there was going to be a large incidence of COVID. No, weren't interested. Didn't want to gather evidence. And that wasn't the policymakers going out and asking for expertise. They wouldn't have found it anyway, because there were these one or two oddballs, coming up who weren't among the usual suspects. They were never going to be on the sort of the Rolodex or
Right.
And yet had that insight. That was, well, it's too late really to have mitigated or reduced that risk. It's in the wild populations of deer. Heard about the mink. She knew it.
She knew it was
before.
going to happen.
She told them, and they weren't prepared to do anything until there was a disaster.
That's a shocking story. But I guess leads into my final question that I'd like to put to Luke Bevan, who is a recent graduate of our doctoral program at STEaPP and now works as a senior researcher at ZINC Venture Capital. And I wanted to come to you, Luke, on, because your PhD work was so much about uncertainty and dealing with it. This issue of to what extent appropriate institutions of expertise should actually admit to ignorance and uncertainty came through strongly in your talk, that you see it as a strength, as part of kind of leading up to puzzling. But to what extent, when does it become a kind of a delegitimizing factor? What are the tensions there, and what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think a lot of the tensions come down to coming back to what we were saying about values. The values that you hold will affect the way that you believe uncertainty should be handled and what the appropriate mechanisms are. I think having come from STEaPP, being formerly of this parish, one of the things that STEaPP really tries to do is to train MPA students in a variety of different techniques that will allow them to better handle different kinds of uncertainty in different kinds of policy contexts. But I think also what's behind that is attempting to inculcate different values and different virtues around the way that people handle uncertainty. It's not just to give them the technique and to apply that. And I think even when scientists are trying to manage uncertainty in different ways, they within scientists, as a sort of broad brush term, there can be very different values that they hold. One small example that I was involved in, I was briefly a small cog in the government science advice process around COVID, was myself and colleagues had produced some information based on some scientific work that we had done, and we supplied this to a policymaker. And there was a bad result because the policymaker took that information and used it in a way that was inappropriate for that piece of information. And as part of coming from STEaPP, my training kicked in, and I was like, okay, there are ways of communicating uncertainty that we know are pretty good. The new STEaPP system, I don't know if anyone's familiar with that, is a sort of an acronym that helps you find the different aspects of uncertainty that you want to communicate. We used that, and that wasn't effective. So I suggested to our colleagues that in the future we build in a process of submitting our uncertainty communications like an oppositional reading, like what a politician would do when they're, how can this possibly be misinterpreted, and what's the most mischievous reading of this particular piece of information. But my colleagues quite vehemently disagreed with me, that this was something that scientists were not meant to be doing. Right, so we were both.
I thought it was called peeling.
Yeah. I mean, we're both people from the sort of scientific class of people with comparable backgrounds, but we held quite different values. So I guess I'm kind of interested in how the institutions, it's the scientists themselves will have values, but how institutions can steer people towards different kinds of virtuous behaviour.
Really interesting. Yeah. Lovely. We are coming. We're running a little late, but I suggest if people are willing that we go on until 7:05, if there's interest in the discussion, and then of course we're going to have drinks outside, so you're welcome to stay and join us for the reception. But at this point, I'd like to open it up. Do any of you have thoughts, questions, issues? Yeah, Adam.
Hello, Roger and the panel. Really interesting stuff. I guess I was reflecting that I've been a sous Sherpa in government, setting up a social science expert panel between what was the Ministry of Energy, Climate and Environment at that point. That was seen internally to be incredibly effective in engaging policy and influencing direction, versus there was a sort of chief scientist who was a physicist who had a science advisory committee made up of physical scientists and engineers who were less successful. And part of the behaviour I observed amongst the civil servants around me was a kind of antibody reaction to what was seen as a kind of blocking and critical mode of behaviour, I suppose, from that group. So there were tactics to sort of, how do we get the chief scientist to just get this signed off so we can proceed with what we want to do, as sort of bypassing of this kind of this problematic body. Whereas the social scientists were very social sciencey, right? They engaged, they saw the alternative perspective, they presented things in ways that were empathic, that kind of thing. So I wonder if there are two things there. One is about the kind of, we talked about virtues and kind of values, but there's also the styles of kind of engagement, which I guess different experts come to some extent naturally with or not. But also about, I guess, the evidence underpinning the kind of claims that you make about what's required. And so, for me, there's a kind of, experiential knowledge that I can bring to this. But what was the, I what was the source of the evidence around kind of the claims you make about the kinds of things that are needed for these institutions?
Yeah, so first, I mean, we should talk. I mean, that's absolutely fascinating. I think this is what Rainer and Sarowitz were getting at when they're talking about appropriate expertise. I mean, it's exactly what you said. It's not just we need institutions of expertise, but it's got to be the right expertise for the problem. And that depends what the problem actually is. In the pandemic, so things like vaccine hesitancy, for example, there's good empirical research that if you just go to someone and say, here's the facts on health outcomes on vaccination, that necessarily doesn't move the dial on whether people will reduce their hesitancy. If you go to someone, and in the United States, one of the most effective messages on vaccination for black people in the United States who have good reason to be suspicious of the healthcare system came from a basketball player, LeBron James, who said he had a long, it was after a game in the locker room, he had an 8-minute discussion of here's why I decided to take the vaccine. And the before-after uptake of vaccinations among black Americans was noticeably different. So, I mean, this is, I think, one of the strengths of social science and policy research is that there actually is a good empirical basis for understanding what sort of interventions lead to kind of the outcomes that are shared value. Not everyone shares values, politics is hard, but one of the important things that I think we experts can bring to the table is obviously there are solutions out there that polarize. And one of our jobs, if we have expertise, is to come up with solutions that don't do that, and to try to find more common interest solutions and put them on the table. And I mean, obviously policy is as much art as it is science, particularly in systems that are federal systems. The United States obviously has a very strong hierarchy, but even here with 4 nations, communities, we have a lot of ability to test policies out there. So in our project, the STEaPP project, it was less about evaluating COVID outcomes and more about first documenting and then comparing science advisory mechanisms. How did we think it was going to work? This is how did it work? And then to the extent possible, the third step was how well did it do? Policy evaluation is wickedly complicated in these contexts. But I do hope that the empirical lessons of pandemic response, again, led by the social sciences, will be drawn and then fed back into what we do next.
Any other questions?
Sure. Thanks a lot, Roger. It's fascinating stuff. It's always good to hear the latest line that you're traveling down. And you touched on a really important issue about sort of not codifying, but terms of reference, I think you said, for science communities.
Yeah.
And we've got quite a lot of that in the UK. We've got some of our master's students here today, and one of the things they reflected on in some presentations over today, they picked out a little phrase that appears in our principles of scientific advice, which is don't act to undermine mutual trust, which is a little bit like those job interviews, like job descriptions, where it says you'll be doing this, you'll be doing this, and doing this, and at the end it goes, and anything else we tell you to. And it's kind of like that in this. It's like, here's a bunch of ways that scientists should behave, here's a bunch of ways that politicians should behave, oh, and by the way, don't act to undermine mutual trust.
Yeah.
And I think it was controversial when it was put in, but it does reflect that cultures of science advice and accepting science advice are as important as the institutions themselves. They go hand in hand. So when you gave that map of all the people you spoke to around COVID, you kind of reflected a little bit on institutions, but you didn't speak to the cultures of science advice in those different places. Can you just say something about what you got from your study in that respect?
Yeah. So the first thing I'll say in response, I'm going to kind of turn that around. I'll apologize. Institutions are culture. Institutions are the embodiment of rules, regulations, structures of the cultures that we want to emphasize value. And so, I mean, I'll give you a very clear difference. The chief scientific advisor model, which is very Commonwealth, very British, it works to some degree pretty well, I would say, in the UK. Maybe in a pandemic it wasn't the best model, but it doesn't travel. You can't take that model and parachute it into the United States or parachute it into Italy. It's just not going to work. And so there are existing institutional structures Whether they're appropriate expertise or not, we can debate. Japan, fascinating case. Japan is on the more positive side of response, partly because of hard lessons learned with Fukushima and the first SARS and then H1N1. Japan science advisors have, for better or worse, been in demand. And so there was a culture of understanding and policymakers and experts who knew each other and had worked together before. A lot of this is going to get down to contextuality. New Zealand, all right, small country, off far away, that has been developing, again, the chief scientific advisor model, but in doing so in the last decade or so, Sir Peter Gluckman leading that effort, was probably very well positioned for a pandemic, both geographically, but also culturally, because science advice was viewed. South Korea, another great example. The South Korean Anthony Fauci, I don't remember her name, was viewed as a national hero. And partly it's cultural, but also because of the recent experience with public health emergencies. And also a culture also in South Korea where, and if you traveled in Asia before COVID, everybody's wearing masks already. It wasn't controversial. I mean, so when we look at how science advice is implemented elsewhere, in my long COVID talk, I put a picture up. It's like abstract art, but it's an institutional map of how science advisory structures looked in different countries, and they're all completely different. And I would say part of that difference is because they have different political cultures, different social cultures, different institutional, and that's perfectly fine. But at the same time, I do think there are some of these general principles for how we connect expertise and decision-making that actually travel. And it's not, oh, you need this person in this committee and this chief medical officer. It's less formulaic than that. I mean, it's hard to, you express somebody, when you're trying to share the cultural characteristics that make institutions tick, I can't say that I fully understand that, but we all know, we've all been in institutions, some institutions work well and some don't. And I think this is the sort of thing where, again, social scientists, policy experts, people at STEaPP, I mean, we should be able to provide expert guidance on expertise. And a huge part of that is how do we build the cultures that we want to model and keep in perpetuate. I don't have the answers for that, but I think that's, if there's one wish I had, it would be that science, I thought when I was preparing this talk, my smart aleck talk was going to be science advice is not a thing. I want science advice to be a thing. I want it to be like diplomacy, like military intelligence, like central banking. I want to say science advice, and most of us say, oh yeah, I know what you're talking about. If I say science advice now, it kind of washes over us. It's not a thing yet, and I want it to be a thing.
Yeah.
I was thinking about your point about diplomacy, and I think, having studied that somewhat, I think a lot of the value of diplomacy is the ability to manufacture consent as an institution. And that's all fine and well when you're a nation state and you want to present a coherent message to whatever counterpart you're dealing with. But the culture of science, you could argue, doesn't necessarily run on that as an institution. And so how do you sort of mediate between attempting to manufacture consent as an institution whilst maintaining, I guess, the veracity of that knowledge production process?
Yeah, this is a fantastic, this is a great question. It's an important question too, because one of the strengths of science is the ability to dissent and argue and have minority views and different views. And in the pandemic, one of the things that came out early was, well, but maybe there wasn't enough diversity in our expertise. Maybe there wasn't enough people out there to challenge models and so on. So military organizations actually institutionalize dissent. They have the red team and the blue team, and they say, all right, give us, where's the weakest part of our argument? We create scientific assessment mechanisms, so most well known as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Those assessments work best when they bring dissenters inside. And I think it's perfectly reasonable for advice, and this is why I think honest brokering is important. If your advice is a policy option, it gets back to clumsy solutions. Not everyone has to agree on the science to agree I mean, we could have a big debate over flooding in Boulder, Colorado. When's it gonna flood? How often is it gonna flood? But we could say, well, if you build your house up on the hill, it's not gonna flood no matter who's right about the site. So there are robust decision strategies that make sense. I think it's really important, and it's one, and I see this, COVID origins is one. A lot of times experts work real hard to keep other experts silent. Oh my gosh, that's controversial, that's not acceptable to talk about. But the reality is, appropriate expertise brings that in, and we have those healthy debates, and we service it. It's okay. Again, go back to economics as an example. You put 5 economists in a room and you'll get 12 opinions. So we're used to that, and it's part of the culture. And so sometimes I think we've gone too far as experts in asserting our own authority and expertise. We're infallible. Those people who disagree with us, they're deniers or they're ignorant. Science is healthy when we're open and transparent. So I think we hit on a key issue. I don't think we've figured out institutionally how to do that in all cases. It's a really important point.
Thank you, everyone. So I did want to just, as we're finishing, just come back to this issue of to what extent institutions of appropriate expertise should be, as Sarah put it, the ones who kind of could hear policy demand. And what happens, Luke, back to the other Sarah's point, is when there's not that policy demand, when there's no demand for better evidence, what did you make of those?
I think it's a really important point. We were talking about this before the session. It's the sort of thing that expertise is completely irrelevant until you need it, and then it's essential. So again, I think this gets to a culture. There will be some overhead cost at keeping these sous Sherpas on staff year-round, because you don't know when you're going to need expertise. And it's one of those things that in a well-functioning society, this is where political leadership comes in. You need to have that background of knowledge, of science, of expertise, so that when the volcano erupts, or the nuclear power plant explodes, or Russia invades Ukraine and energy policy goes crazy, that you have the experts ready at the moment you need them. One of the lessons of COVID is that if you wait for the disaster, it's too late. Because things get politicized very quick, decisions have to be made, in 10 minutes. And so I really don't know. I tell people, if I knew how to get better politicians, I'd be in a different field and get paid more. But we need to create a culture where there's a respect for the importance of expertise. And the military has it, economics has it, diplomacy has it, so I'm sure we can do it. But it's just how do we do it more broadly in areas that repeated failures show we have it.
Fantastic. Well, Roger, just remains to thank you.
Thanks, Joe.
Really
Thanks,
interesting
everybody.
talk. Great questions. Thanks, everyone. And do stay and join us. We're going to have some drinks out in the, it's in the reception, in the cafe.